Man insults Elon Musk in a supermarket, then realizes who he just mocked. The supermarket hummed with the usual buzz of mid-morning activity. Shoppers maneuvered carts down crowded aisles, children tugged at their parents' sleeves for snacks, and announcements for special discounts echoed faintly over the store's speakers. It was an ordinary scene, unremarkable save for one small anomaly. A man in a black hoodie and jeans, standing in the fresh produce section, inspecting a bundle of kale with an intensity usually reserved for life-altering decisions. Elon Musk blended in as much as any billionaire could, his attire casual and his demeanor unassuming. He had chosen this particular store because it was quiet, out of the way, and less likely to draw attention. For him, grocery shopping wasn't a chore to delegate. It was a rare, grounding experience, a moment of normalcy amidst the chaos of running empires and chasing Mars. But even as he moved quietly through the produce aisle, Elon couldn't entirely escape the curious glances. A woman near the apples squinted at him, then whispered something to her friend. A teenager with a basket full of snacks paused, phone in hand, clearly debating whether to ask for a photo. Elon ignored them, focused instead on selecting the perfect avocado. In the next aisle over, a man named Brent, broad-shouldered, loud, and clearly in a hurry, was making his way toward the registers. His cart rattled with an assortment of cheap beer, frozen meals, and a suspiciously large bag of chips. Brent had no time for subtleties or social niceties. He was the kind of person who believed the world owed him something and wasn't shy about letting everyone know it. Brent rounded the corner into the produce section, his cart narrowly missing an elderly woman who shuffled past with a wary glance. "Watch it, lady," he muttered, barely sparing her a glance. His eyes landed on Elon, who was now meticulously examining a head of lettuce. Brent didn't recognize him, not immediately. To Brent, Elon was just another guy in his way, blocking access to the cucumbers. "Hey, buddy," Brent barked, his voice carrying far more aggression than the situation warranted. "You gonna stand there all day? Or you gonna move?" Elon glanced up, his expression calm but curious. "Plenty of room on the other side," he said simply, gesturing to the wide space behind him. Brent's face twisted into a scowl. He wasn't used to being dismissed, especially not by someone who looked as unremarkable as Elon did. "Yeah, well, maybe you shouldn't park yourself in the middle of the aisle like you own the place," he shot back, his tone dripping with condescension. A few shoppers nearby paused, their attention drawn to the brewing confrontation. Some exchanged uneasy glances, while others lingered, clearly intrigued by the potential for drama. Elon, however, remained unfazed. He set the lettuce back on the shelf and turned his full attention to Brent. "I wasn't aware I needed a permit to buy vegetables," Elon said, his tone light but firm. Brent sneered, clearly interpreting Elon's calmness as weakness. "Yeah, well, maybe you should be aware of how to get out of the way," he said, taking a step closer. "People like you, always thinking the world revolves around you." The irony of the statement wasn't lost on Elon, but he said nothing. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying Brent as though he were a particularly perplexing equation. The tension in the air thickened, and more shoppers began to notice the scene. A mother with a toddler paused at the end of the aisle, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. A teenage stock clerk peeked out from behind a display of bananas, his eyes wide as he whispered into his radio. Brent, emboldened by the attention, decided to press further. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" he jeered. "Or are you just one of those tech nerds who can't handle real people?" Elon raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. He could feel the stares now, the weight of the crowd's curiosity pressing down on him, but he remained steady. "Real people?" he echoed, his voice calm. "What does that make you?" The crowd let out a collective gasp at the retort. Brent's face darkened, his bravado faltering for just a moment before his scowl deepened. "Oh, you think you're funny, huh?" he said, his voice rising. "Let me guess, you're one of those wannabe influencers, posting your little shopping trips online, thinking anyone cares." Elon's lips quirked into a faint smile, though his tone remained neutral. "I'm not much for posting," he said, "but I do care about making an impression." The words, innocuous as they were, seemed to hit a nerve. Brent took another step closer, his imposing frame casting a shadow over Elon. "Listen here, smart guy," he growled. "You don't know who you're messing with, and you don't know who you're insulting," came a quiet voice from behind them. Both men turned to see the teenager with the snack basket standing hesitantly at the edge of the crowd. His face was flushed, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped his phone. "That's Elon Musk," the boy said, his voice growing steadier as he spoke. "You're talking to the guy who's literally sending rockets into space." A murmur rippled through the crowd, the name igniting recognition in several faces. The woman with the toddler gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The elderly woman Brent had nearly collided with earlier narrowed her eyes, her expression shifting from wary to incredulous. Brent blinked, momentarily thrown by the revelation. He looked at Elon again, this time with a flicker of uncertainty. But the doubt was fleeting, quickly replaced by defiance. "Elon Musk?" he repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Yeah, right. What would a guy like him be doing here?" "Shopping," Elon said simply, gesturing to his cart, which now held an assortment of fresh produce. The simplicity of the answer only seemed to infuriate Brent further. "Yeah, sure," he said with a sarcastic laugh. "And I'm the Queen of England." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, some shoppers clearly amused by Brent's defiance, while others exchanged incredulous looks. The teenager with the phone took a step closer, his confidence growing. "No, seriously," he insisted. "That's him. Look." He held up his phone, which displayed a quick Google search of Elon Musk's photo. The resemblance was undeniable. Brent's face twisted as he stared at the image, his bravado wavering once more. He looked at Elon again, searching for some kind of confirmation, or perhaps a denial. But Elon simply stood there, his calm expression unchanging, as though he were waiting for Brent to put the pieces together. The tension in the air was palpable now, the crowd fully invested in the unfolding drama. Brent's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his ego battling with the creeping realization that he might have made a mistake. But rather than back down, he doubled down. "Even if you are him," he said, his voice loud and defiant, "what does that even matter? You're just another guy in a store, acting like you're better than everyone else." The crowd gasped again, their collective disbelief almost audible. Elon tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady as he studied Brent. "Better than everyone else?" he repeated, his tone calm but laced with quiet intensity. "No, but I do believe in setting an example." Brent's scowl deepened, his frustration boiling over as the weight of the crowd's judgment began to press down on him. And yet, he wasn't ready to concede. Brent's scowl deepened as he squared his shoulders, his broad frame now fully turned toward Elon Musk. The murmurs from the crowd had grown louder, the name Elon Musk sparking a mix of curiosity and disbelief among the shoppers. Phones were coming out now, the unmistakable glow of screens lighting up faces as people snapped photos or recorded videos. Brent could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, their judgment cutting through his stubborn defiance like a knife. "Set an example, huh?" Brent scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "That's rich coming from someone who thinks he's too important to step aside for real people." Elon tilted his head slightly, his sharp gaze fixed on Brent. "Real people," he repeated, his tone calm but probing. "You keep saying that. I'm curious. What makes someone real to you?" Brent blinked, momentarily thrown off by the question. He hadn't expected Elon to respond so directly, and for a brief moment he faltered. But the weight of the crowd's attention, mixed with his own bruised ego, pushed him to double down. "Real people are the ones who don't get handed everything on a silver platter," Brent shot back, his voice rising. "People who actually work for a living instead of playing with toys and pretending to change the world." A ripple of murmurs ran through the crowd. Some attendees exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with Brent's words. Others appeared fascinated, their eyes darting between Brent and Elon like spectators at a boxing match. The tension in the air was thick, the entire produce aisle now a stage for this unexpected confrontation. Elon remained unfazed, his expression calm as he considered Brent's words. "You think I was handed everything?" he asked, his tone even but laced with curiosity. Brent rolled his eyes. "Oh, please," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Guys like you don't know what it's like to struggle. You've probably never had a real job in your life." The crowd gasped softly, the audacity of Brent's statement hanging in the air like a challenge. Several people exchanged incredulous looks, clearly aware of Elon's journey from humble beginnings to becoming one of the world's most influential entrepreneurs. The teenager with the phone, who had spoken up earlier, stepped forward again. That's not true," the boy said, his voice hesitant but determined. Elon Musk started his first company from scratch. He literally slept in the office while building it. He's worked harder than most people ever will. Brent shot the boy a glare. "Mind your own business, kid," he snapped. "You don't know anything about hard work." The teenager's cheeks flushed, but he didn't back down. "I know enough to respect someone who's actually making a difference," he said, his voice gaining strength. "What have you done?" The crowd stirred again, their whispers growing louder. Brent's jaw tightened, his frustration mounting as the weight of their judgment pressed down on him. He turned his glare back to Elon, his voice rising as he tried to regain control of the narrative. "Making a difference?" Brent sneered. "You mean building overpriced cars and blowing up rockets? Yeah, real noble. Meanwhile, people like me are out here trying to put food on the table. But I guess that doesn't matter to someone like you." Elon raised an eyebrow, his expression thoughtful rather than offended. "So, you think my work doesn't matter?" he asked, his tone curious rather than confrontational. Brent crossed his arms, his posture defensive. "What I think is that you live in a bubble," he said. "You don't have a clue what it's like for the rest of us." Elon's gaze didn't waver. "And what would you have me do differently?" he asked, his voice steady. "Stop building rockets? Stop working on renewable energy? Stop creating jobs?" The crowd grew silent, Elon's questions cutting through the noise like a blade. Brent hesitated, his bravado faltering for the first time as he struggled to come up with a response. He glanced around at the onlookers, their eyes boring into him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "I'm just saying," Brent muttered, his tone less confident now. "Maybe you should think about helping real people instead of..." "Whatever it is you're doing," Elon nodded slowly, his sharp eyes still locked on Brent. "You're right," he said, his tone calm but deliberate. "I should think about how to help people. And I do, every day. That's why I work as hard as I do. So that one day, the world you're describing won't exist." Brent blinked, momentarily thrown off by the sincerity in Elon's voice. But he quickly recovered, his frustration boiling over once again. "Yeah, well, good luck with that," he said, his tone mocking. "You're not exactly doing a great job if people like me are still struggling." Elon's gaze softened slightly, his expression shifting from calm to contemplative. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly. Brent hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "Why do you care?" he asked defensively. "Because," Elon said, his tone steady, "I want to understand where you're coming from." The crowd watched intently, the tension in the air thick as Brent shifted uncomfortably under Elon's unwavering gaze. For a moment, it seemed as though Brent might walk away, his bravado finally cracking under the weight of the interaction. But instead, he squared his shoulders, his voice defiant as he replied, "Brent." Elon nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Well, Brent," he said, his tone calm but firm, "I'm sorry you feel that way, but I believe we can do better, together. That's what my work is about. Not just building rockets or cars, but creating a future where people like you don't have to struggle the way you do now." Elon remained calm, his posture relaxed and his expression unreadable. He didn't engage further, simply observing as Brent's emotions bubbled closer to the surface. The silence between them was deafening, broken only by the hum of the store's air conditioning and the occasional beep of a checkout scanner in the distance. One brave soul in the crowd, an older man wearing a flannel shirt and pushing a cart filled with canned goods, stepped forward. "Maybe you should back off, buddy," he said to Brent, his tone measured but firm. "You're making a scene." Brent whirled around to face him, his broad shoulders squared and his jaw tight. "A scene?" he repeated, his voice dripping with incredulity. "This guy thinks he's better than everyone else, and I'm the one making a scene?" The older man held his ground, his expression unflinching. "Nobody said that," he replied evenly. "But you're the one shouting. Maybe take a breath." "Yeah." The crowd murmured in agreement, their earlier unease shifting slightly toward solidarity. Brent's face reddened, his eyes darting between the older man and Elon, who still hadn't moved from his spot. The silence from Elon only seemed to fuel Brent's frustration, his need for validation growing more desperate by the second. "Yeah, well, maybe I wouldn't have to shout if people like him didn't act like they're so much better than the rest of us," Brent snapped, his voice rising again. He gestured toward Elon with a sweeping motion, his movements jerky and exaggerated. "What's he even doing here, huh? Playing humble billionaire? Picking out organic lettuce like he's one of us?" The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, some spectators shaking their heads in disbelief while others exchanged amused glances. The teenager with the phone, still standing near the edge of the aisle, couldn't hold back any longer. "Dude, you don't even know what you're talking about," the boy said, his voice tinged with exasperation. "Elon Musk started from nothing. He worked his way up. He's literally trying to make the world better. And you're out here throwing a tantrum over cucumbers." Brent rounded on the teenager, his expression darkening. "Oh, here we go," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Another fanboy who thinks this guy walks on water. Let me guess, you're gonna tell me how Tesla is saving the planet next." The teenager flushed but didn't back down. "Better than doing nothing," he shot back, his tone sharp. "At least he's trying." Brent let out a derisive laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, right," he said. "Trying to make himself richer, maybe. Meanwhile, the rest of us are out here scraping by, trying to keep our heads above water. You think he cares about people like us?" The crowd stirred uncomfortably, Brent's words striking a chord with some of the onlookers. A few nodded subtly, their expressions thoughtful. Others, however, exchanged skeptical glances, clearly unconvinced by Brent's argument. Elon, for his part, remained silent, his sharp eyes observing the crowd's reaction. He could see the divide forming, the tension between those who admired his work and those who felt left behind by it. It wasn't a new dynamic. He had encountered it before, in boardrooms and online debates, in interviews and protests. But seeing it play out here, in the middle of a supermarket aisle, carried a different weight. The older man in the flannel shirt spoke up again, his tone firmer this time. "You think yelling at him is going to fix anything?" he asked, his gaze steady on Brent. "If you've got problems, maybe take them up with someone who can actually do something about it. The guy's building rockets, not running the grocery store." Brent's face twisted into a scowl, his fists clenching at his sides. "Yeah, well, maybe he should start caring about the little people," he muttered, though his voice lacked some of its earlier fire. He looked back at Elon, his frustration still simmering but tempered now by the weight of the crowd's attention. A woman near the back of the group, holding a toddler on her hip, chimed in hesitantly. "I mean, it's not like he owes us anything," she said, her tone uncertain but genuine. "He's done more than most people ever will. Maybe we should just let him shop in peace." The toddler squirmed in her arms, reaching out toward the shelves of brightly colored fruit. The woman adjusted her hold, her face flushing slightly as she realized she'd spoken louder than she intended. But her words seemed to resonate with some of the onlookers, their murmurs growing quieter as they considered her point. Brent, however, wasn't ready to let it go. He took a step closer to Elon, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" he said, his tone laced with bitterness. "You walk around here like you're one of us, but you don't have a clue what it's like." Elon finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. "What is it you think I don't understand?" Brent hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the direct question. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The silence stretched between them, the crowd waiting with bated breath for his reply. After a moment, Brent shook his head, his frustration boiling over once again. "Forget it," he muttered, his voice low but still audible. You wouldn't get it anyway. Elon didn't respond, his expression unreadable as he continued to study Brent. The tension between them was thick, the weight of the unspoken conflict pressing down on the entire aisle. The crowd remained silent, their earlier murmurs replaced by a charged stillness. The teenager with the phone stepped forward again, his voice breaking the silence. Maybe he wouldn't get it, the boy said, his tone steady but pointed. But maybe you wouldn't get him either. The crowd around the produce aisle had grown even larger, the scene now drawing shoppers from across the supermarket. What had started as an argument over aisle space had morphed into a public confrontation between a belligerent skeptic and one of the world's most recognizable figures. Maybe I wouldn't get him? Brent repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he addressed the teenager. He pointed a finger in the boy's direction, his scowl deepening. Kid, you don't even know what you're talking about. You've probably been spoon-fed fairy tales about this guy since you were in diapers. The teenager flushed but held his ground. I know enough to recognize when someone's making a difference, he said, his voice trembling slightly but growing steadier with each word. What have you done, huh? Besides yell at people in supermarkets? The crowd let out a collective murmur, a mix of amused chuckles and hushed gasps at the boldness of the boy's words. Brent's jaw tightened, his face flushing with anger as he turned his glare back to Elon. And you're just gonna stand there and let these people talk to me like this? Brent demanded, his voice rising. You're supposed to be the big shot, right? The genius? Say something. Elon remained calm, his hands resting lightly on the handle of his shopping cart. He didn't flinch under Brent's aggressive tone, nor did he respond immediately. Instead, he observed the man with the same quiet curiosity that had defined his demeanor from the start. Brent's frustration boiled over, his voice growing louder as he addressed the crowd. You all act like he's some kind of saint, he said, gesturing toward Elon. But what has he actually done for you? Has he paid your bills? Fixed your car? Helped you when you were struggling? A few people in the crowd exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions thoughtful. Brent's words, though laced with bitterness, carried a kernel of truth for some. Not everyone in the supermarket shared the teenager's admiration for Elon Musk, and the divide was becoming increasingly clear. Maybe he hasn't fixed my car, an older woman said quietly, stepping forward from the crowd. She was petite, with silver hair neatly tied back, and her voice carried a calm authority. But he's working on things that might fix the planet. And I'd say that's worth a lot more than a free oil change. The crowd murmured in agreement, the woman's words sparking a subtle shift in the energy of the room. Brent, however, wasn't ready to back down. He turned to the woman, his expression incredulous. Fix the planet? He repeated, his tone mocking. Oh, come on. You really think building fancy cars and blowing up rockets is gonna save the world? The woman raised an eyebrow, her gaze steady. It's more than you're doing, she said simply. The crowd chuckled, the tension easing slightly as a ripple of amusement spread through the group. Brent's face turned a deeper shade of red, his scowl intensifying as he looked around at the growing number of amused faces. You think this is funny? Brent snapped, his voice rising again. You all stand there, laughing at me, like I'm the problem. But I'm not the one pretending to be some big hero, while people like me are out here struggling to make ends meet. The crowd fell quiet again, Brent's words landing heavily in the hushed space. For a moment, no one responded, the weight of his frustration hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Elon finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. What kind of help are you looking for? The simplicity of the question caught Brent off guard. He blinked, his scowl faltering slightly as he processed Elon's words. What? He said, his tone defensive. What do you mean? You said people like you are struggling, Elon said, his gaze steady. What would make a difference? What kind of support would help? Brent hesitated, clearly unprepared for the question. He opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, his thoughts scrambling for an answer. The crowd watched intently, their earlier amusement replaced by curiosity as they waited for Brent's reply. I don't know, Brent muttered finally, his tone less certain. Maybe something real. Not all this space stuff. People don't need Mars, they need help here. Elon nodded slightly, his expression thoughtful. I understand that, he said. And I agree, helping people here on Earth is just as important as exploring the stars. That's why I work on both. Brent narrowed his eyes, his frustration reigniting. Yeah, right, he said, his tone dripping with skepticism. You mean you make billions off people like me and then pretend you're saving the world? That's what you really mean? The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, the tension building once more as the divide between supporters and skeptics widened. Some attendees nodded subtly, their expressions sympathetic to Brent's grievances. Others shook their heads, their admiration for Elon unwavering. The teenager with the phone stepped forward again, his voice breaking the tension. You don't even know what you're talking about, he said, his tone sharp. Do you know how many jobs Tesla and SpaceX have created? How much they've done for renewable energy? You're just mad because you don't understand it. Brent turned to the boy, his scowl deepening. And you think you do? He snapped. You're what, 15? What do you even know about the real world? The boy flushed but stood his ground. I know enough to recognize someone who's actually trying to make a difference, he said firmly. And I know enough to see through people like you. The crowd stirred again, their attention shifting between Brent and the teenager. Brent's face reddened further, his fists clenching at his sides as he struggled to regain control of the situation. Elon remained silent, his sharp gaze fixed on Brent as the man's frustration reached its boiling point. The air was charged with anticipation, every shopper waiting to see what would happen next. Brent's frustration simmered dangerously close to the surface, his fists clenching and unclenching as he glared at the teenage boy who had spoken up against him. The boy, emboldened by his earlier words, stood his ground, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face as he noticed the intensity of Brent's glare. You've got a big mouth for a kid, Brent growled, his tone low and menacing. Maybe you should learn when to keep it shut. The boy's face flushed, but he refused to back down. Maybe you should learn how to respect people who've actually done something with their lives, he shot back, his voice trembling slightly but growing steadier with each word. The crowd stirred again, the boldness of the boy's response drawing murmurs of admiration from some and uneasy glances from others. Brent's jaw tightened, his frustration boiling over as he turned his attention back to Elon. And you, Brent said, his voice rising. You think this is funny? Just standing there, letting people talk down to me like I'm the bad guy? Elon raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but unreadable. He didn't respond immediately, his silence only fueling Brent's anger further. What's the matter? Brent snapped. Got nothing to say now, Mr. Big Shot? Or are you too busy thinking about your next rocket launch to care about real people? The crowd murmured louder, the divide between supporters and skeptics growing more pronounced. Some attendees nodded subtly, their expressions sympathetic to Brent's grievances. Others exchanged incredulous glances, clearly astounded by his audacity. An older man near the back of the crowd stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise. Maybe you should take a step back, son, he said, his tone firm but not unkind. You're embarrassing yourself. Brent whirled around to face the man, his face red with anger. Embarrassing myself? He repeated, his voice incredulous. You're all standing here, acting like this guy walks on water, and I'm the one embarrassing myself? The man shrugged, his expression unflinching. He's not the one yelling in a grocery store, he said simply. The crowd chuckled softly, the tension in the air easing slightly as a ripple of amusement spread through the group. Brent's face darkened, his scowl deepening as he looked around at the growing number of amused faces. You think this is funny? Brent snapped, his voice rising again. You all stand there, laughing at me, like I'm the problem. But I'm not the one pretending to be some big hero, while people like me are out here struggling to make ends meet. The murmurs fell quiet again, Brent's words landing heavily in the hushed space. For a moment, no one responded, the weight of his frustration hanging in the air like a storm cloud. The teenage boy broke the silence, his voice cutting through the tension. Nobody's saying you're the problem, he said, his tone measured but firm. But maybe you're not helping yourself either. Brent's scowl deepened, his fists clenching at his sides as he turned back to the boy. "And what would you know about it?" he snapped. "You're just a kid. You don't know the first thing about real life." The boy hesitated, his confidence wavering slightly under Brent's intense glare. But before he could respond, a woman near the front of the crowd spoke up. "Maybe he doesn't," she said, her voice calm but steady. "But he's right about one thing. You're not helping yourself by yelling at everyone." The crowd murmured in agreement, the woman's words sparking another subtle shift in the energy of the room. Brent glanced around at the onlookers, his frustration mounting as he realized he was losing control of the narrative. "Oh, I see how it is," Brent muttered, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You're all on his side now, huh? The billionaire who doesn't even know you exist? Real nice." The crowd stirred again, some attendees exchanging uneasy glances, while others shook their heads in disbelief. Brent's bitterness was clear, but so was his desperation. A man grasping for validation in a situation that was quickly spiraling out of his control. Elon remained silent, his sharp gaze fixed on Brent as the man's frustration reached its boiling point. The air was charged with anticipation, every shopper waiting to see what would happen next. Brent turned back to Elon, his voice rising again. "You think you're better than me?" he demanded, his tone accusatory. "You think you're better than everyone here? Standing there, all quiet and smug. Like none of this matters to you?" Elon finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. "I think we all matter," he said simply. The simplicity of his response caught Brent off guard, his scowl faltering slightly as he processed Elon's words. The crowd watched intently, their earlier murmurs replaced by a charged silence as they waited for Brent's reaction. For a moment, it seemed as though Brent might back down, his bravado cracking under the weight of the confrontation. But then, he shook his head, his frustration boiling over once again. "Yeah, right," he muttered, his tone bitter. "You don't care about people like me. You care about your rockets and your money and your stupid electric cars. That's it." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, the tension building once more as the divide between supporters and skeptics widened. Some attendees nodded subtly, their expressions sympathetic to Brent's grievances. Others exchanged skeptical glances, clearly unconvinced by Brent's argument. "Brent," Elon said, his voice calm but firm, carrying an authority that cut through the silence like a blade. "You're upset. I get it." Brent blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected acknowledgement. His scowl faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered, his fists still clenched at his sides. "Yeah, I'm upset," he snapped, his tone defensive. "Why wouldn't I be? Guys like you think you run the world while the rest of us are left to fend for ourselves." Elon nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You're angry because you feel like no one's listening," he said, his tone measured. "Like no one cares." Brent hesitated, his jaw tightening. The directness of Elon's words had struck a nerve, but he wasn't ready to let his guard down. "Damn right," he muttered, his voice low but audible. "Nobody gives a damn about people like me." Elon took another step forward, his sharp gaze steady on Brent. "I don't think that's true," he said, his voice soft but deliberate. "But I think it's easy to feel that way when the world seems unfair." The crowd murmured softly, the weight of Elon's words rippling through the group. Some attendees nodded subtly, their expressions thoughtful, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Brent, however, remained tense, his shoulders squared as he met Elon's gaze. "You don't know anything about my life," Brent said, his voice rising again. "You don't know what it's like to wake up every day and wonder how you're going to make it through the week. You don't know what it's like to feel invisible." Elon didn't flinch under Brent's intensity. "You're right," he said simply. "I don't know your life. I don't know the challenges you face every day. But I do know what it's like to feel invisible." Brent frowned, clearly thrown off by the response. "Yeah, right," he muttered, his tone skeptical. "Like you've ever been invisible a day in your life." Elon smiled faintly, the expression tinged with something unspoken. "When I started my first company," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of memory, "I slept in the office because I couldn't afford an apartment. I showered at the YMCA. And when I tried to convince people to believe in what I was building, Most of them didn't care. The crowd stirred, Elon's words drawing murmurs of surprise and recognition. Even Brent's defiance wavered slightly, his expression shifting as he processed the unexpected revelation. "You see the success now," Elon continued, his tone steady. "The rockets, the cars, the headlines. But you didn't see the years of rejection, the failures, the moments when it felt like the world was moving on without me." Brent's scowl softened slightly, though his posture remained tense. "So what?" he muttered, his voice quieter now. "You're still a billionaire. You're still part of the problem." Elon nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe I am," he said. "Or maybe I'm trying to fix it." The crowd murmured again, the divide between supporters and skeptics becoming less pronounced as Elon's words settled over them. Brent looked away, his jaw tightening as he struggled to hold on to his frustration. "You think fixing the world is that easy?" Brent asked, his tone bitter. "You think a few rockets and electric cars are going to change anything?" "I don't think it's easy," Elon replied, his voice firm. "I think it's hard. But I also think it's worth trying." The crowd grew quieter, the weight of Elon's words pressing down on them like a physical force. Even the teenager with the phone, who had been so vocal earlier, stood silently now, his eyes wide as he watched the exchange. Brent's fists unclenched slowly, his posture relaxing slightly as he let out a heavy breath. For the first time since the argument began, he looked less like a man spoiling for a fight and more like someone who had carried a burden for far too long. "You don't get it," Brent said finally, his voice quiet but still tinged with bitterness. "You say all the right things, but you don't know what it's like to be stuck. To feel like no matter how hard you try, nothing changes." Elon's gaze softened, his expression tinged with empathy. "Maybe I don't," he said quietly. "But that doesn't mean I'm not trying to understand." Brent didn't respond immediately. His shoulders slumped slightly, and he ran a hand through his hair, his earlier bravado now replaced with exhaustion. The crowd watched intently, their earlier judgment giving way to a quiet curiosity as they waited to see what would happen next. Elon took another step forward, his presence commanding but not overbearing. "Brent," he said, his tone calm but firm, "you're not invisible, and your struggles matter. But so does what we do next, how we choose to move forward." Brent looked at him, his expression conflicted. "And what's that supposed to mean?" he asked, his voice low. "It means we can keep fighting each other," Elon said. "Or we can start figuring out how to fight for something bigger." Brent opened his mouth as though to respond, but no words came out. The frustration that had fueled him for so long seemed to falter, replaced by uncertainty. He looked around at the crowd, searching for validation, but the sea of faces staring back at him offered none. Elon stepped forward, closing the distance between them. His tone was calm but carried the weight of finality. "Brent," he said, his voice cutting through the silence, "anger can be powerful, but it won't get you where you need to go. And lashing out won't make the world fairer." Brent's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. His earlier fire was gone, replaced by a quiet defensiveness as he absorbed Elon's words. "I understand why you're angry," Elon continued, his gaze steady. "The system is flawed. People are struggling. But the solution isn't to tear each other down. It's to build something better." The crowd murmured softly, Elon's words resonating with many. Some nodded in agreement, while others remained quiet, their expressions contemplative. Even those who had initially sided with Brent seemed to reconsider their stance, their earlier skepticism giving way to respect. Brent shook his head, his voice quieter now. "Easy for you to say," he muttered. "You've already made it." "And it wasn't easy," Elon replied, his tone firm but not unkind. "Nothing worth building ever is. But that's why I'm here. Not just to succeed, but to make success possible for others." Brent hesitated, his defiance wavering. He glanced around again, his earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty. The crowd's eyes were still on him, their judgment pressing down like a weight he couldn't shake. A voice from the crowd broke the silence. "He's right, you know." It was the older woman with the silver hair who had spoken up earlier. She stepped forward, her expression resolute. "We all have struggles. But blaming someone else won't fix them. Brent looked at her, his scowl softening. So what am I supposed to do? He asked, his voice low. Just sit back and hope things get better? No, Elon said, his tone sharp but not unkind. You take that anger, that frustration, and you use it to create change. But you do it with purpose, with focus. The teenager with the phone stepped forward again, his voice steady. Or maybe just start by not being a jerk to people, he said, his tone pointed but not malicious. The crowd chuckled softly, the tension in the air easing slightly. Brent's face reddened, but he didn't lash out. Instead, he looked down at his feet, his earlier bravado fully crumbled. Elon extended a hand, his expression thoughtful. It's not too late to start, he said. The first step is always the hardest. But it's worth it. Brent hesitated, his eyes darting between Elon's outstretched hand and the expectant faces of the crowd. For a moment, it seemed as though he might refuse, his pride holding him back. But then, slowly, he reached out and shook Elon's hand. The crowd erupted into applause, the sound filling the aisle as the tension finally broke. Some clapped hesitantly, their earlier skepticism still lingering, but most smiled and nodded, the confrontation having turned into a moment of reconciliation. Brent looked down, his voice quiet. I don't know what to say, he muttered. You don't have to say anything, Elon replied. Just take the first step. Brent nodded slowly, his posture less tense. He looked at the crowd again, his earlier defiance replaced with a quiet humility. I'm sorry, he said, his voice low but sincere. For all of it. The older man in the flannel shirt nodded approvingly. Takes a big man to admit when he's wrong, he said. The teenager smiled faintly. And maybe next time, just chill a little. Not everything's a fight. Brent chuckled softly, a hint of a smile breaking through his otherwise somber expression. Yeah, he said. Maybe. Elon stepped back, his presence still commanding but no longer overbearing. The crowd began to disperse slowly, the tension that had held them in place finally releasing. Some lingered, still murmuring about what they had just witnessed. While others returned to their shopping, the confrontation now just another story to tell. Brent stood in place for a moment, his hands in his pockets as he watched the crowd thin out. He looked at Elon again, his expression a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. Thanks, he said quietly, for not just writing me off. Elon nodded. Everyone has potential, Brent. You just have to decide what you want to do with it. Brent nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his steps unsteady but purposeful as he disappeared into the next aisle. The supermarket returned to its usual rhythm, the hum of activity picking up once more. Elon remained where he was, his expression calm but introspective as he watched the crowd dissolve. The teenager with the phone approached him hesitantly, his cheeks flushed. Mr. Musk? The boy said, his voice tentative. That was really cool. Elon smiled faintly. Thanks, he said. And thank you for standing up for what you believe in. That's how change happens. The boy beamed, his earlier nervousness replaced with pride. He held up his phone. Mind if I take a picture? My friends are never gonna believe this. Elon chuckled softly. Sure, he said. As the boy snapped the photo, the older woman with the silver hair approached, her expression warm. You've got a way with people, she said. Not many would have handled that as gracefully as you did. Elon shrugged. Everyone's fighting their own battles, he said. Sometimes they just need someone to remind them they're not alone. The woman nodded, her smile deepening. Well, you reminded all of us of that today. Thank you. Elon inclined his head, his gaze thoughtful. The confrontation may have ended, but the lessons from it lingered, a quiet reminder of the power of understanding and compassion. As the crowd fully dispersed, the supermarket returned to its usual hum of activity. Brent had walked away with his head lowered, the weight of the encounter pressing down on him. A few shoppers still whispered about what had unfolded, their expressions ranging from amazement to quiet contemplation. For those who had witnessed it, the confrontation was a moment they wouldn't soon forget. A rare glimpse into the character of a man as polarizing and influential as Elon Musk. Elon stood near the produce aisle, his cart still half filled with fresh vegetables and avocados. Despite the attention and tension from earlier, his demeanor remained steady, a quiet confidence radiating from him. The teenager with the phone lingered nearby, too nervous to leave but clearly in awe of what had just happened. "Mr. Musk," the boy said hesitantly, clutching his phone like a lifeline, "can I ask you something?" Elon turned to him, his expression softening. Of course, the boy hesitated, glancing down at his sneakers before looking up again. "Do you ever, with all the stuff you've done, do you ever feel like it's not enough? Like people still don't get it?" Elon smiled faintly, the question striking a chord. "All the time," he admitted. "But that's part of it, isn't it? Trying even when it feels like it's not enough. If you wait for everyone to understand before you start, you'll never start." The boy nodded slowly, his earlier nervousness giving way to thoughtfulness. "That makes sense," he said. I just wanted to say thanks for everything you're doing. It's really inspiring." "Thank you for saying that," Elon replied, his tone warm. "But remember, inspiration goes both ways. It's people like you, curious, passionate, willing to speak up, that remind me why I do what I do." The boy grinned, his face lighting up. "Thanks, Mr. Musk," he said, his voice more confident now. "I won't forget this." As the boy walked away, a quiet settled over the produce section. Elon glanced at his cart, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. The older woman with the silver hair approached once more, her steps unhurried and her expression thoughtful. "You handled that well," she said, her voice steady. "Not many people could have turned that around like you did." Elon shrugged lightly, his gaze still thoughtful. "It's not about handling it," he said. "It's about listening. Everyone's carrying something, even if they don't show it." The woman nodded, her eyes kind. "You've got a good heart," she said. "I hope people see that more often." "Thank you," Elon said simply. As the woman walked away, Elon finally resumed his shopping, his mind still replaying the events of the morning. The encounter with Brent hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. A reminder of the challenges that came with trying to create meaningful change. A few weeks later, a video of the supermarket confrontation surfaced online. Recorded by multiple bystanders, it quickly went viral, drawing millions of views and sparking countless debates in the comment sections. Some praised Elon's calm demeanor and willingness to engage with someone like Brent, calling it a masterclass in leadership. Others criticized Brent's outburst, dissecting every word he had said as a symptom of deeper societal frustrations. But what surprised everyone was Brent's own response. In a post that appeared on a social media platform, he shared his side of the story. "I wasn't proud of how I acted that day," the post read. "I let my anger get the better of me. But what stayed with me wasn't the embarrassment. It was what Elon said about using anger to create change. It's something I'm still trying to figure out, but it gave me hope. Maybe things can be different." The post went viral in its own right, drawing a mix of support and skepticism. But for Brent, it was the first step in a journey he hadn't expected to take. A journey toward understanding, growth, and perhaps even redemption. As for Elon, he moved forward as he always did, focused on the next project, the next challenge, the next opportunity to push the boundaries of what was possible. But every now and then, when the weight of the world seemed especially heavy, he thought back to that day in the supermarket, to a moment when listening had been the most important thing he could do. Because sometimes, changing the world didn't mean building rockets or electric cars. Sometimes it just meant hearing someone out. Thank you for watching this powerful story. It's not just about Elon Musk or Brent. It's about the choices we make when faced with conflict. This story reminds us that everyone is carrying unseen struggles, and sometimes, a simple act of patience or understanding can make all the difference. Elon's ability to stay calm and listen, even when insulted, teaches us a critical lesson about leadership. True leaders don't respond to anger with more anger. They respond with empathy and clarity. In this moment, Elon didn't just diffuse a tense situation. He gave Brent an opportunity to reflect, to be seen, and to take a step toward growth. Brent's journey shows us something, too. It's okay to feel frustrated, but what matters is what we do with that frustration. Do we let it consume us, or do we channel it into something constructive? His eventual realization proves that it's never too late to grow or to turn anger into a force for good. Now we ask you, how do you handle moments of tension in your life? Do you respond with empathy like Elon, or do you let frustration take over? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and tell us about a time when someone's kindness changed your perspective. If this story inspired you, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to see more stories like this one. Let's spread the message that compassion, understanding, and listening are just as powerful as any invention or innovation. Thanks for watching.